Rain pelted my shoulders. As the security guard Bruce gripped my elbow and marched me across the asphalt, he did not look at me, keeping his gaze fixed on the double doors of the building we had just exited. I was 50 years old, and after 30 years in this industry, I was being escorted out of my own building like a shoplifter. In my left arm, I held a soggy cardboard box containing my coffee mug, a few technical manuals, and some framed photographs of my late father. Through the tall glass windows of the second-floor break room, I could see the glow of warm lights and the silhouette of a celebration. Red and yellow balloons floated against the ceiling. People were laughing, clinking glasses, and patting Clara Jenkins on the back. She was my replacement, a 24-year-old graduate with impressive theoretical credentials, and not a single hour of real-world coding experience under stress. My boss, Donald Henderson, stood next to Clara. He raised a crystal glass and a theatrical toast, looking down at the parking lot. Our eyes met through the rain-streaked glass. Donald smiled, a cold, smug curve of his lips, and mouthed 3 words that I could easily read. He was saying that Clara would fix my mess. It was a cruel summation of my 3 years of constant toil. 1,095 days of skipped meals, sleepless nights, and solving impossible equations to build the Vanguard traffic system. I had taken a chaotic urban grid of 2 million people and designed an adaptive software core that allowed the city to move like a living organism. When I started, the city was choked with congestion, and emergency response times were climbing. Under my management, response times dropped by 40%. But Donald did not care about the numbers or the lives saved. He cared about his quarterly reports and his personal bonus. 30 minutes ago, he had slid an empty cardboard box across his polished desk and told me they were moving in a conventional direction. He claimed my methods were too organic, too complex, and that they needed a traditional framework that could be easily managed by a cheaper workforce. I did not argue. I did not plead or raise my voice. I merely stood up, packed my few belongings, and walked out. Decades of engineering excellence were dismissed with a few corporate platitudes. Bruce opened the passenger door of my 10-year-old truck, his posture rigid. He was a good man who had greeted me every morning for years, but now he was following protocol. I tossed my wet box onto the seat and climbed in. As I turned the key, the engine sputtered, matching my mood. I sat in the cab for a few minutes, watching the warm party continue behind the glass. Clara Jenkins was laughing, holding a glass of champagne. They had been preparing this transition for months. Clara had been brought in as a junior consultant, supposedly to ease my workload. In reality, she was shadowing me, taking notes on my methods and reporting back to Donald. In every meeting, she had questioned my decisions, advocating for simple, textbook algorithms instead of my adaptive neural nodes. She did not understand that a traffic grid is not a static math problem. It is a shifting, breathing beast influenced by weather, accidents, construction, and human psychology. I shifted the truck into gear and drove out of the lot. The windshield wipers creaked, fighting the heavy downpour. I had poured my soul into that traffic system. It was my crowning achievement, the culmination of everything I had learned about network architecture and flow dynamics. I had spent countless weekends tweaking the logic gates, teaching the system to anticipate congestion before it happened. And now Donald was handing the keys of my masterpiece to a novice who believed she could run it with standard templates. My apartment was dark when I arrived. It was a quiet place on the 4th floor of an older building downtown. There were no pets, no family waiting for me, and no distractions. My career had been my life, a fact that had cost me my marriage 10 years ago. I had sacrificed personal relationships, vacations, and normal sleep patterns to build Vanguard mobility. I sat on my sofa, my wet shoes resting on the hardwood floor, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the room was deafening. For the first time in 3 decades, I had nowhere to be tomorrow morning. There were no deadlines to meet, no system anomalies to patch, and no team meetings to lead. I was 50 years old, unemployed, and stripped of the project that had defined my existence. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of whiskey, drinking it slow. I looked out the window at the distant city skyline. The streetlights blinked in perfect coordination, a rhythm I had coded myself. The emergency lanes were clear and the flow was smooth. For now, I knew the system would continue to run on my optimized parameters for a few days, but without constant monitoring and adjustments, it would eventually degrade. Real-world data would clash with Clara's rigid textbook templates. I wondered how long it would take before Donald realized his mistake, and whether he would ever admit it. As the alcohol warmed my chest, I set my glass down. I was angry, yes, but beneath the anger there was a strange, cold clarity. They had taken my job, but they could not take my mind. The system was a reflection of my thoughts, my logic, and my intuition. Without me, it was just dead code. I closed my eyes and let the darkness take me, resolving to let the consequences of their arrogance unfold. The first day after my termination was silent. My phone lay on the kitchen counter, dark and cold. I spent the hours walking through the park, watching the wind rustle the leaves, trying to adjust to the sudden lack of pressure. I had spent 3 years under a constant crush of deadlines, and the silence was disorienting. The second day was much the same. I visited a local library, read some articles on urban planning, and bought groceries. I felt like a ghost wandering through a city that I had helped keep alive. I knew Vanguard Mobility was likely presenting my system to the board, taking credit for my years of work, and showcasing Clara Jenkins as their new star. I imagined Donald Henderson smiling, shaking hands, and pretending that the transition had been seamless, but the peace did not last. On the morning of the third day, as I was brewing coffee, my phone vibrated. The screen lit up with Clara's name. I did not pick it up. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail, then went back to my coffee. 3 minutes later, she called again, then again. She was panicking, clearly realizing that the theoretical models she had studied at her university were useless against the harsh reality of a rain-slicked afternoon rush hour. The streetlights outside my window flickered, their timing already beginning to slip as the local node struggled to sync with the main server. By noon, she had called 7 times. There were no text messages or voicemails, just the persistent, desperate ringing of a phone. By the time the sun set, the count had reached 12. I sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker. The grid was still moving, but I could tell from the flow of headlights on the highway that the response times were beginning to lag. The system was crying out for adjustments, and Clara did not know how to make them. At midnight, as I sat on my living room floor reading an old engineering journal, the phone rang for the 19th time. I watched it slide across the hardwood floor, vibrating under the force of Clara's panic. I did not answer. I knew what she was facing. The system had a scheduled optimization cycle every 48 hours. If she did not input the correct environmental variables, the system would default to standard textbook parameters, which would immediately choke the downtown sector. I went to bed and slept soundly, leaving the phone on the floor. When I woke up on the 4th day, the phone showed 27 missed calls from Clara and 3 from Donald. I made breakfast and did not check my messages. Around 10 in the morning, a different name appeared on the screen. It was Fiona Yates, a junior engineer on the traffic team. She was a hard worker whom I had hired a year ago. I hesitated, then answered. Fiona's voice was tight and breathless, and I could hear the hum of the server room in the background. She told me the entire North Quadrant had locked up during the morning rush hour. Traffic was backed up for miles, and emergency services were completely blocked. She said they had to dispatch medical helicopters for 3 separate accidents because ambulances could not get through. I listened in silence, my chest tightening. I asked her what Clara was doing. Fiona sighed, her voice trembling. She said Clara was trying to recalibrate the neural nodes using standard linear algorithms, but it was only making the gridlock worse. The system was treating the congestion as a temporary delay rather than an active bottleneck, causing the lights to stay red for minutes at a time. Fiona said Donald was pacing the floor, shouting at everyone, and that the mayor's office had called twice to demand answers. Fiona told me they needed me to come back. I told her that was impossible. I reminded her that Donald had escorted me out with security while throwing a party for my replacement. I told her the system was now Clara's responsibility. Fiona pleaded with me, her voice breaking. She said she understood my anger, but real people were suffering. She said a woman in the North Quadrant had almost died in an ambulance because of the delay. That statement hit me like a physical blow. I had built the Vanguard traffic system to save lives, not to feed a corporate ego. I was furious with Donald, but the citizens of the city did not deserve to pay the price for his incompetence. I told Fiona I would think about it, then ended the call. I stood by the window, looking down at the street below. The traffic was moving sluggishly, and I could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance. The grid was breaking down, just as I had predicted. The textbook solutions Clara had championed in our meetings were failing when confronted with the chaos of a real city under stress. I felt a deep sense of validation, but it was overshadowed by a growing concern for the safety of the people on the road. I knew I had to act, but I would not do it on Donald's terms. I would not let him use my expertise to cover up his failure. If I returned, it would be to claim what was mine and to make sure Donald Henderson paid for what he had done. I sat down at my desk, pulled out a fresh notepad, and began to outline a plan. I needed to document the failures carefully, using the real-time data Fiona had mentioned to build an undeniable case against their management. An hour after I hung up with Fiona, my doorbell rang. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and saw Donald Henderson standing in the hallway. The contrast between the man before me and the smug executive who had raised a champagne glass 2 days ago was stark. His silver hair was disheveled, his expensive tie was crooked, and dark circles sagged under his eyes. He looked like a man who had not slept in 48 hours. I opened the door but stood firmly in the center of the frame, blocking his entry. Donald forced an awkward, desperate smile and asked if he could come in. I did not move. I crossed my arms and asked him what he wanted. He cleared his throat, adjusting his jacket, and said we needed to talk professionally. I told him we had nothing to discuss, reminding him that he had fired me and had me escorted out of the building. Donald winced, saying that the timing of my departure was unfortunate and that there had been a misunderstanding. I laughed, a short, sharp sound. I told him there was no misunderstanding. I had read his lips through the window when he toasted Clara Jenkins and called my work a mess. Donald's smile vanished, replaced by a tense, nervous twitch. He admitted that the company was facing some technical challenges with the system integration. He said, Clara was a brilliant engineer, but she was encountering some unexpected variables in my network architecture. He asked me to help them stabilize the grid. I leaned against the doorframe, looking down at him. I asked if he wanted me to fix my mess, the very mess he had been so eager to replace. Donald looked away, his jaw clenching. He shifted his weight, switching to his corporate pitch. He offered to hire me back immediately as a senior consultant, promising to triple my former salary. He said all he needed was for me to spend a few days in the office to guide Clara through the optimization process. I looked at this man who had dismissed 30 years of my experience with a wave of his hand. He had sacrificed my reputation to boost his quarterly numbers, and now he expected me to save his career for a fistful of dollars. I told him no. I said the word slowly, letting it hang in the quiet hallway. Donald stared at me, his eyes widening in disbelief. He asked if I was serious, reminding me that he was offering a massive sum of money. I told him that my refusal was absolute, just as absolute as the security escort he had ordered for me. His desperation quickly turned to anger. His face flushed a dark red, and he stepped closer, trying to intimidate me. He told me that this was not about my pride. He said lives were at stake and that the grid crisis was affecting the entire city. I did not blink. I told him that lives were always at stake, which was why I had worked 70-hour weeks and missed my own father's funeral to ensure the emergency vehicle routing was flawless. I reminded him that he had cut my engineering budget and reduced my support team to save pennies, showing zero concern for public safety when it suited his balance sheet. Donald pointed a finger at my chest and threatened me. He said he would go to the board of directors and ensure that my name was blacklisted across the entire industry. He claimed he would destroy my career and make sure I never wrote a single line of code for any traffic system in the country. I smiled at him, my voice remaining calm and level. I told him to go ahead. I urged him to explain to the board exactly why he had fired the lead architect of a multi-million-dollar system without securing a knowledge transfer. I told him to let the board know that his hand-picked replacement had paralyzed the city within 48 hours of taking over. I suggested he see how the directors responded to his brilliant management decisions. The color drained from Donald's face. His hand dropped to his side, and his mouth hung open slightly. He was a corporate politician, used to bullying subordinates and hiding behind policy. But he had no leverage here. He asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted him to leave my apartment. I took a step back and closed the heavy wooden door, clicking the lock into place. I stood in my quiet foyer, listening to his retreating footsteps down the hall. I felt a wave of satisfaction, but I knew the battle was not over. Donald would try to spin the situation to the board, blaming my code for the failure rather than his own rush to replace me. He would try to paint me as a saboteur. I needed to move fast. I walked back to my desk, picked up my phone, and dialed Fiona. I needed to know exactly what Clara was doing to the servers, and I needed hard data on the gridlock. If Donald wanted a war, I would give him one, but I would fight it with logic, data, and the law. As I waited for the call to connect, I looked at the photographs on my desk. My father had taught me to stand my ground against men like Donald, who built their empires on the backs of others. Firing me was one thing, but attempting to blackball me from the industry was an act of war. I would use every legal and technical asset at my disposal to protect my intellectual property. I would ensure Vanguard Mobility paid for every single drop of sweat I had poured into that grid. The following morning, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It contained an address of a quiet cafe near the edge of the financial district, a time, and a brief note asking me to meet for the sake of the city. It was signed by Mayor Eleanor Thorne. I knew Eleanor. She was a practical, sharp leader who had supported my adaptive traffic project from its inception. When I arrived at the cafe, she was sitting in a corner booth, staring at a cup of black coffee. The strain of the past 4 days was visible in her face, and her eyes were tired. As I sat down, she thanked me for coming. I told her I had not agreed to anything yet. She nodded, signaling the waiter for another coffee. She told me the city was on the verge of a total shutdown. Emergency response times had spiked by 40%, and Vanguard Mobility was recommending that they scrap the new system entirely and revert to the old, mechanical traffic timers. I told her that would be a disaster, as the old system could not handle the current volume of 2 million citizens. She agreed, saying it would be catastrophic. Eleanor asked me what had happened between me and Donald. I told her the truth. I explained that Donald had fired me without warning, replaced me with an inexperienced graduate, and had me escorted out by security while the office celebrated. She shook her head, saying she had been told I had resigned to pursue other opportunities. I told her that was just corporate spin to cover up Donald's arrogance. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the table, and introduced the legal leverage I had spent the night preparing. I explained that Vanguard Mobility did not actually own the core adaptive engine of the traffic system. Under my original employment agreement, the underlying adaptive algorithms remained my personal intellectual property, which I had licensed to Vanguard under strict conditions. One of those conditions was that the source code could only be modified by certified developers, namely myself. I told the mayor that, when Clara Jenkins attempted to rewrite the neural nodes with her standardized algorithms, she had violated my copyright. I explained that this was a direct violation of federal law under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. Furthermore, I revealed a more serious crime. To satisfy the city's quarterly audit, Donald had to present a signed compliance handoff sheet proving that the system transition had been completed and verified by the lead engineer. Since I had been fired, Donald had forged my signature on that document. Fiona Yates had found the electronic logging record showing that the document was uploaded from Donald's personal computer. Hours after I was escorted from the building, I explained to Eleanor that this forgery violated California Penal Code Section 470. Because the signature was forged, the handoff was legally void ab initio, meaning it was invalid from the very beginning. I also pointed out that Donald's sudden firing of the entire support team over the last few months, culminating in my termination, was a clear violation of worker notification laws under Title 29 of the United States Code, Section 2101, commonly known as the Warren Act. They had failed to give the required 60 days of advance notice for a mass layoff, exposing the company to massive federal fines and individual employee lawsuits. Combined with Donald's breach of fiduciary duty as a corporate officer who actively damaged his own company's primary asset, Vanguard Mobility was legally indefensible. The mayor stared at me, her coffee cooling. She asked if I could prove the forgery. I pulled a flash drive from my pocket and set it on the table. I told her it contained the metadata and the system logs that Fiona had retrieved, showing the exact timestamp of the upload and the digital fingerprint of Donald's computer. I told her that Vanguard Mobility was in material breach of both their contract with the city and their licensing agreement with me. Eleanor's eyes sharpened. She asked what I proposed. I told her that the city had clear legal grounds to terminate its contract with Vanguard Mobility immediately. I suggested that she bypass Vanguard entirely and hire me directly as a municipal consultant. I would take the source code, restore the system to its pre-termination state, and manage the grid myself, but I demanded certain guarantees. I insisted on complete creative control over the system, my name on all future patents and white papers, and the authority to build my own engineering team, starting with Fiona Yates. The mayor did not hesitate. She picked up the flash drive and slipped it into her purse. She said she would have her legal counsel draft the emergency declaration and the consulting contract immediately. She told me to be ready to move within 24 hours. As I walked out of the cafe, the rain had stopped and the clouds were breaking. I felt a surge of energy that I had not felt in days. Donald Henderson had thought he could destroy my career and steal my work, but he had underestimated my leverage. He had played a game of corporate politics, but I was playing a game of law and logic. I had the mayor, the data, and the federal statutes on my side. Tomorrow, the board of directors would hold an emergency meeting to address the crisis, and I planned to be there to deliver the final blow. That evening, Clara Jenkins called me. Her voice was trembling. Stripped of the academic confidence she had displayed during our previous meetings, she confessed that she was completely lost. She admitted that she did not understand the relationship between the traffic nodes, and that her attempts to apply textbook algorithms had only worsened the gridlock. She begged for my help, saying that the board was preparing to scrap the entire system. I agreed to meet her, but not at the office. I told her to meet me at the central library the next morning, instructing her to bring nothing but a pen and paper. We met in a small study room on the 3rd floor. Clara looked exhausted, her eyes red and shadowed. I did not offer her comfort. I told her flatly that I was not there to save her career. I explained that she had taken a job she was not qualified for and had participated in my humiliation. Clara looked down, admitting she had been wrong. She said she had believed the textbook models were sufficient, but now realized the traffic system was too complex. I turned my notebook to show her the organic patterns of the downtown quadrant. I explained that the system worked because it was adaptive, adjusting to crowd psychology, weather, and real-time accidents. I told her that before I helped stabilize the grid, I wanted accountability. I demanded that she stand up at the board meeting tomorrow and tell the absolute truth about the system's failure, Donald's interference, and her own limitations. She paled, realizing it would ruin her reputation, but she eventually nodded, agreeing to my terms. The next morning, I dressed in a sharp dark gray suit, combed my short hair, and shaved. I walked into the Vanguard Mobility headquarters at 9:30, feeling a cold determination in my chest. The executive floor was silent and tense, filled with hushed whispers. I sat in the waiting room directly outside the glass-walled conference room, keeping my posture relaxed and confident. Inside, I could see Donald Henderson gesturing wildly at a presentation slide, sweating through his shirt as he blamed my code for the gridlock. Clara Jenkins sat to his right, staring blankly at her hands, her face pale and drawn. At exactly 10:30, the boardroom door opened, and a security guard invited me inside. As I walked to the end of the table, the chairman thanked me for coming. He said Clara had shared some shocking information regarding the system's operation and the forgery. Donald sputtered, claiming that Clara was lying and that my code was a flawed mess. I pulled a printed copy of the electronic logs and the original license agreement from my leather portfolio and slid them across the table to the chairman. I told the board that every line of the system's core adaptive logic was protected under federal copyright, and that Vanguard had no authority to modify it without my consent. I stated that Donald's attempt to force an uncertified override had violated the law, and that his forgery of my name on the handoff sheet was a criminal offense. Donald's face turned a deep, furious purple, but his words were cut short when the double doors opened again. Mayor Eleanor Thorne walked into the room, accompanied by the city attorney. Eleanor announced that as of 9 in the morning, the city had formally terminated its contract with Vanguard Mobility due to material breach and criminal forgery. She stated that the city was exercising its contractual right to engage my services directly as an independent municipal consultant. The chairman looked stunned, realizing their primary source of revenue was gone. I looked at Donald, whose eyes were filled with rage. I told the board that the system would be fully operational within 48 hours, under my direct management and with my own team of engineers, starting with Fiona Yates. I had taken back what was mine, and Vanguard Mobility was left with nothing but a breach of contract lawsuit and a criminal investigation into Donald's forgery. Within 48 hours, the city's traffic grid was moving smoothly once again. Emergency response times dropped to record lows, and the bottleneck in the North Quadrant vanished. The mayor held a press conference, praising the adaptive system and announcing the creation of the new Municipal Innovation Division, with me as the director. 1 month later, I walked past the Vanguard Mobility headquarters on my way to City Hall. Through the glass lobby, I could see employees packing their desks into cardboard boxes. The loss of the city contract had ruined the company. Near the elevator, I saw Donald Henderson holding a box of his personal items, looking older and defeated. He had been stripped of his position, his reputation, and his career. Our eyes met through the glass. I did not smile or gloat. I simply nodded once and walked away, turning my back on the corporate politics that had tried to define me. I was 50 years old, my system was saving lives, and I was finally building something that would outlast us all.